Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Julia Fournier is a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Julia, thanks for speaking with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg, for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by speaking with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
I see my dissertation as like a social and intellectual history of childcare policy in the United States since the 1970s. I'm essentially trying to understand a moment in US history when, after married white women are entering the workforce in greater numbers, there are cultural changes that have been brought on by the feminist movement. And there are all the economic changes that we know taking place during the 1970s, in particular, the decline of the family wage. I'm really interested in the question that lots of different groups are grappling with during this period of who should care for children, and how they should be compensated, and how that question becomes a pretty high stakes political debate, with lots of options that are on the table that I think would seem kind of some of them at least would seem pretty far gone in terms of today's contemporary political context. I mean, just I guess, like, for example, the sort of framing event for my dissertation is in 1971. Congress comes really close to passing what would have been the country's first universal child care program. It's called the Comprehensive Child Development Act. And a universal child care program that in the 1970s would have cost around $2 billion, which I don't know the exact conversion, but that's a lot more $1 billion today, right? It passes both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, which is something that, I don't know, at least to me today, right now, sounds pretty outrageous in our current political moment. And so it gets really close to passage. President Nixon vetoes it. He calls it the most radical piece of legislation to emerge from the 92nd Congress. He frames it as this dangerous intrusion into family life. And this event is where I think a lot of really great existing histories of childcare policy end. This is sort of the like tragic denouement of decades of prior activism around childcare. But I'm really interested in kind of that 1971 moment as sort of a starting point, and interested in figuring out, after this big moment of potential and that gets rejected, what happens after that, who's trying to pick up the pieces from that veto, and what are some of the other solutions that different groups are advocating for sort of the problem of childcare that is also during this period emerging even more clearly as a social problem that needs to be solved.
Mhm. Well, how far forward do you take it in time?
This is a good question. Into the 1990s, exactly where, I'm kind of still figuring out at this time. My initial instinct was to stop in 1990 because that's when the piece of legislation that currently governs our kind of child care, um, the extent to which we have federal involvement in childcare, that came to pass in 1990 with the um, Child Development Block Grant, passed in 1990 under the Bush administration. That's essentially releasing federal funding to the states to go toward child care programs in whatever way sort of state governments decide to spend it. And that's basically the extent of what we have right now. So my initial instinct was to sort of stop there, because that, in terms of legislation, really that is called child care legislation, and that's directly related to child care. That's sort of where it stops. But lately, I've been thinking about moving a little bit more further in time, maybe having my stopping point as the Clinton welfare reforms in 1996. Because I think even though that is not necessarily something that a lot of people, even historians, would think of as a piece of childcare legislation. I think it has a lot to say about the relationship between motherhood and work and the role of the state in supporting both mothers and children. So that's where my head is at currently, but I'm still at the pretty early stages of this project, so all kinds of things could happen between now and when the dissertation is done. Who can really say?
Sure, but that's part of the fun. Well, what was it that put Hagley on your radar as an important stop for you to do this research?
Absolutely. Well, this is maybe not as academically related, but we have a decent contingent of labor and business historians where I am at UNC. So I had heard really great things just about the institution itself and about the beautiful grounds from some of my colleagues in the history department. So I think even before I had really dug into what collections were available at the Hagley, I had sort of had flagged in my head, oh, like that sounds like a nice place. I should figure out if there's anything going on over there that might be of use to me. But once I finally dug in and started to think about, okay, like what, let me take a look at some of these finding aids. Let me do some searching and see um, what there is to take a look at this wonderful place I've heard so much about. I realized that there's one collection in particular that the Hagley has that has been super, super useful to me, which is the records of an organization called Catalyst Inc., which is was a nonprofit based in New York dedicated to advancing the status of women in the workplace, and the timeline of the sort of Catalyst organization aligns really nicely with the timeline that I'm interested in looking at. I think Catalyst began in the early 1960s, and I'm probably going to pick up in the late 1960s for my dissertation, and they go on, through the 20th century into the 21st century. So the yeah, time-wise, what they were looking at aligns nicely with my interests, but more specifically in terms of subject matter, because Catalyst was a sort of advocacy organization devoted to women's workplace problems. They collected tons and tons of research material about all kinds of things related to women and work. But one of the foremost concerns for women of all classes really related to work during the period that I'm studying is childcare. So Catalyst had boxes and boxes of kind of just research files, subject files on there was, multiple boxes on just childcare. There were multiple boxes on childcare policy, multiple boxes on childcare legislation. So it really, at least for this visit that I took this summer, served as a really fantastic clearinghouse for me at the early stages of kind of my dissertation research to be able to look chronologically through, like starting in the early 1970s, going into the mid 1990s, about, what newspapers are publishing about childcare, the publications of different childcare advocacy organizations. I think one of the great resources that I think was pretty unique to Catalyst was a lot of like Personnel magazine and human resources journals and things that you might not necessarily get in the archive of a feminist organization like the National Organization for Women or like the Women's Action Alliance. I think Catalyst had a little bit more of a sort of focus on business and professional women that I think is going to prove to be really fruitful for my work. So yeah, I was thinking of the Hagley as just like a beautiful woodsy place that maybe I'll get to visit someday. And once I actually got into the materials there, I was blown away by how much there is, and really excited about all the things that I might be able to do with it.
Yeah, it sounds like you uncovered a real treasure trove.
I think so, yeah.
Hmm. Well, what are some of the key questions that you're asking as you do this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one for me, just the sort of broadest and most personal question about childcare, I mean, I think really for me was put into pretty stark focus during COVID. I mean, I have my sort of personal connection to this topic is that um, prior to the pandemic, I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do after undergrad. I had been working a service industry job. Um, I was working at a coffee shop. The coffee shop closed during the pandemic, and I sort of had to find something to do. And I pivoted to fill a need that became pretty severe during COVID, which was for childcare. Lots of people who had relied on, daycare centers and public schools, those were closed, and especially middle class families like needed something to do with their children. While they were at work. So I ended up sort of becoming like a pandemic nanny during that time. And it made me realize, the extent to which middle class lifestyle that depends on two earners in a household also really, really heavily depends on a working childcare infrastructure, but also made me think about the fact that that type of childcare industry or infrastructure, I should say, is really class stratified in the United States. Those quality childcare services are only available to people who can afford it in this country. So just thinking about the contrast between the families that I have worked for, where COVID created sort of a temporary precariousness with regard to childcare, but then thinking about that precarity is just a reality in the lives of many working class families in the United States. That sort of dynamic came into really stark relief for me, and just made me think about like this is a question that is so important to so many families. Why does it not feel like there is a policy solution for this? Why do I not hear politicians talking about this very much when there are so many groups of people who would potentially be, want answers and potentially see a role for the state in doing something about this? That was sort of the initial driving question. But then as I've gotten into the research, a little bit more granular things emerge. I think one of the questions that I feel that I really have yet to answer is kind of what is the role of sort of organized feminism in all of this? In the 1970s, feminists were a very active coalition for that sort of initial Comprehensive Child Development Act. Congresswomen Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm were sponsors of a draft of the child care legislation that eventually passed both houses. Groups like National Organization for Women were pretty active in lobbying and advocating for that legislation. But then at least like from the sort of political legislative side, as you get into the later 70s and the 80s, sort of groups that would describe themselves as feminist first and foremost aren't as involved as I expected them to be later on when those issues come up. And so I'm still kind of trying to figure out whether that's really the case or if there's a reason that some of these groups aren't showing up in the way that I would have expected them to. But yeah, sort of what are the priorities of the feminist movement, or is it a problem of labeling, and are there groups that, if you think about their goals and their tactics, maybe in contemporary terms, we would describe them as feminist, but maybe they weren't describing themselves that way during that time, and why? Those are questions that I'm interested in. Another huge one is just the role of the private sector, like for-profit childcare industry in influencing legislation. That's a big one for me as well. I'm really interested in um, particularly in Kindercare, which I think is in some ways very anomalous in terms of for-profit childcare companies, but also in a lot of ways, like culturally, kind of stands in for many of the sort of hopes and dreams and anxieties that people had during this period about childcare. Most for-profit childcare that families purchased in, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and purchased today do not come from like large national chains with many, many locations. They're much more local, they're much smaller, but KinderCare basically for the past almost 50 years has been the largest for-profit childcare provider. So I'm really interested in how is uh, like what is KinderCare doing to kind of try and influence the kind of political landscape around childcare. And Hagley was actually a place where I got some pretty good leads on that front. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. Could you perhaps give us a bit of a preview? I know you're still working.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I can't make any, grand conclusions or statements at this point, but I definitely have some clues. I guess there were really probably the two documents that I really had like sort of jaw on the floor moments when I was in the reading room. We're both related to KinderCare. The first one, I feel like this happens to me every time I take an archive trip. Like on the first day, like within the first 2 hours, I'll get something which I mean, now I'm gonna jinx it. Maybe I'll have some bad trips coming up because I said this, but I'll get something that really makes me feel like, okay, wow, I'm so glad I'm here. Like this is amazing. And I think my mouth was like literally wide open for maybe 15 full seconds in the reading room. But this one was a basically roster pamphlet from the National Association of Child Care Management, which is a group that I had read about in kind of secondary literature, seen in a couple newspaper articles, and was aware that this was kind of a group of for-profit childcare providers who were interested, who were kind of like a lobbying and advocacy group for the interests of for-profit childcare providers. Like I knew that they had been involved in kind of lobbying against federal regulations around childcare quality standards. That's something that I was aware that they were a part of. And I was also aware that they were part of kind of some efforts to curtail union organizing in childcare. But I wasn't really sure. I sort of was like, I bet KinderCare is probably involved in this, but I don't really know. I don't know if that's true. I don't know to what extent that's true. I don't really know what companies are part of this organization. And I found this roster in the Catalyst records from 1983, and the president of the National Association of Child Care Management is a woman named Ann Mascari, who at the time was the vice president of customer service and government relations at KinderCare. And she's somebody who I also saw coming up in congressional testimony around sort of some of these questions about federally regulated quality standards and basically just what type of involvement the federal government should have in answering all of these questions. So that was a big one for me. I'm definitely going to try and track down more about Ms. Ann Mascari because she seems like an interesting figure. And this sort of confirmed my hunch that KinderCare, at least in the sort of early to mid 1980s, was pretty involved in trying to influence some of these policy questions. So that was huge for me. Another one relatedly was a document from 1989, which was a report or sort of like unfortunately, the whole report was not present in the archive. I only was able to find the sort of title page and the table of contents. But from that, it seemed like it was basically sort of like a KinderCare generated scientific or scientific adjacent kind of study called the KinderCare Report: Perspectives on Childcare in America. And so I think the idea was KinderCare sort of sponsoring a survey of whom I don't know. I wish I knew. I don't know if it's KinderCare sort of clients or if it's like parents more generally. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any information about the methodology of this study, but it has chapter or like section titles with things like freedom to choose and ambivalence over government regulation. Like from the chapter headings, I get the sense that KinderCare is using whatever data they have available to make the case that what parents want and what families want is the maximum number of choices that they can have for childcare. So that means that the federal government is not imposing specific, staff to student ratios, and that centers are not being federally required to mandate like a certain level of credential for their staff, and that the federal government isn't only directing funds towards kind of nonprofit or sort of state-run centers, that if there were to be federal involvement, it would be in a way that would maximize the ability of families to spend their money however they wanted, perhaps on a kindercare center that doesn't meet the sort of federal requirements that were being discussed at this time. So that was a really interesting find for me as well. Doug over in the archives went on a little wild goose chase for me to try and help me find the rest of the report. Unfortunately, we did not come up with it, but I'm hoping, I don't know, that I can get my hands on it someday. But even without the rest of it, just the sort of fact that this exists kind of confirms some of my hunches about the types of arguments that KinderCare and other for-profit childcare companies might be making, and the ways that they might be trying to influence both public opinion and policy more broadly.
Those are some really exciting finds.
I think so. I hope I can find more like that maybe on another visit. We'll see.
Oh, terrific. Well, Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to share your work with us today. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate the chance to be able to talk some of this through. Honestly, I've had a busy summer of research, but I haven't had a chance to really do a lot of writing or processing of what I've found. So just having you ask these questions and being able to think through some of this was actually really helpful to me as I get ready to sort of crank out some drafts this year.
Oh, that's great. And thank you for saying so. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, you can join us online. Visit hagley.org. That's Hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.